right, let's go ahead and get started. So hi everyone, my name's Shadi Hassan. I'm really excited about this panel. I appreciate everyone coming to join us today to kind of talk about the ways that networking research can intersect with policymaking. I think we're all going to learn a lot from the group of discussants that we have here with us today. Really impressive group. I'll let folks go ahead and introduce themselves with kind of their name, what they're about, what they've been thinking about these days. And I'd ask everyone to also mention maybe one area that their current work intersects with policymaking in. And we'll start with our remote participants. Maybe start with Steve, and then we'll bounce around the screen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Song, Senior Director for Infrastructure Mapping and Development at the Internet Society. A thing I'm working on particularly is an open standard for describing terrestrial fiber optic networks, which is really part of a larger mission to kind of reveal the physical underpinnings of the internet, from undersea cables to terrestrial fiber, data centers, CDNs, and more.
Awesome. Nicola?
Hi, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicola Comini. I'm a senior specialist in the digital vice presidency at the World Bank. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I mainly work on investment projects in Latin America, plus I dedicate some time to research, in particular to questions around the traditional digital gap, how infrastructure resilience in facing climate change, but also how the digital gap interconnects to inequality in society. And lately we have tried to understand how we can leverage these new data sources beyond the traditional ITU and telegeography information on connectivity. So I'm referring to microdata from LinkedIn or Ookla, and how we can leverage this information to answer more traditional questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Sole?
Thank you, Shadi. It's great to join you on this panel. My name is Soluka Edena, and I'm a connectivity solutions specialist at GIGA, which is a joint UN initiative between UNICEF and ITU to connect every school in the world and towards digital inclusion. And in a nutshell, what we do at GIGA is support governments to roll out universal connectivity in an informed manner. So we provide data, open source tools, best practices to enable this collaboration between stakeholders. And importantly to your question, tools to inform both when defining those policies as well as how to track that they're actually being effective. Yeah, over.
Awesome. Mike?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Jensen. I work for a global NGO called the Association for Progressive Communications, which is a membership organization with members primarily in the global south. And we work on a variety of digital equity issues, ranging from gender-based violence online all the way through to improving connectivity for people who don't have it or have poor connectivity. And that's kind of the area that I work on mainly. We have a program within APC called LockNet, where we're assisting small remote communities to develop their own infrastructure to get connected to the internet. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, I want to kick off the discussion by starting to define what policy means for each of you. And I'll kind of maybe start with Nicolo, kind of speaking from a multilateral institution perspective. But in your work, what does policy impact look like? And when you're trying to have policy impact, who are the types of stakeholders that you're working with and potentially trying to influence their decision-making processes?
Thanks for the question. When we speak about policy, we refer to the so-called enabling environment. You may have the best infrastructure in the world in a country, but if you do not have the right policy framework, that infrastructure is not going to deliver meaningful results for the population and then for the economy development, etc. So policy is a critical part also because the right policy framework then unlocks the financial investments that are needed when it comes to financing and building and deploying digital infrastructure that can be extremely costly, particularly when we move towards rural areas that traditionally are the unconnected ones. Hence, policy is critical. We do not try to influence any policy, just to be sure. We try to support policy changes that we believe are actually helpful to achieve development and social objectives, so economic and social development objectives. Our main counterparts are traditionally Ministry of Telecommunications, then there are different frameworks around the world and around the countries. The Ministry of Telecommunications were traditionally joined with the Transport Ministry in some countries, or the more general Infrastructure Ministry. So you can find different type of approaches to the topic, but this is usually our main counterpart. And then some countries now have started deploying the so-called digital agencies. For instance, Mexico has a very important digital agency that takes care of the overall digital ecosystem in the country. The idea is to build a constructive dialogue with them and trying to, for instance, bring to the table what the World Bank can offer in terms of regional but also global experience. Try to look at other countries that were successful in pushing specific policy changes and try to, let's say, build a case for adopting certain policy changes. If you want to get into the technical work that we do when it comes to policy, the World Bank has mainly two financial products. So the first one is financing specific project and infrastructure. So the government borrows money for the deploying of a specific project. For instance, deploying X kilometers of fiber optic in a specific region of the country. The other product, financial product, is the so-called policy-based loan. So if a country is promoting specific public policy that, in our opinion, it actually can bring to social and economic development, then it unlocks a specific budget that is not linked or tied to a specific infrastructure project in this case, but it's, let's call it, it's general budget for the recipient country. So that's what we try to do when it comes to policy. And of course, then we have all the so-called knowledge products through the production of general reports, research paper, that again, what we try to do is to see, okay, what are the best policies to achieve certain objectives, what are the most meaningful, but also most impactful one. And on this side, I guess what Sol mentioned before, the M&E, so tracking the results and the impact of these policies is a key aspect in all this discussion. Thanks.
And now, maybe to turn to Sol, so when you think about the policy impact of the work that Giga is doing, how do you all conceptualize that?
Yeah, thanks for that. And maybe I can best illustrate that with some examples. I mean, Giga does a lot of things, and it goes from identifying or mapping the schools, the telecoms infrastructure, tracking at real time, connectivity status, modeling costs, and so on, right, with our partners. But I'm going to just point you to the map behind me. It's a global map, largest global map on school connectivity, and where each dot is a school. If it's green, we know that at some point it was allegedly connected. If it's red, it wasn't connected. And then you will see if you go live, there's actually blinking lights where it shows that it's live. So we get it about every 1 to 4 hours, we get an update. And how is this useful, and how does this, interlink with policy? Is really just a couple of examples. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, to give you an idea, there are 13 independent ministries of education alone. So I'm not talking about different ministries, I'm talking about education specifically. Now, each of them with a database, being able to visualize what each of those ministries is doing in certain areas. And we know that connectivity efficiency and connectivity rollout and universal connectivity can really only be reached through collaboration. So if you don't have that sort of central source of data or truth, let's say, in inverted commas, because it can always be improved, it's very difficult to find that collaboration between different stakeholders. In Honduras, this has gone directly to the National Strategy of Digital Education, where they're actually using the map to just see, they've put together this policy, now they're tracking to see how is it advancing, which schools are coming online, where is it lagging behind. Maybe one last example is in Brazil. We've worked closely with the different ministries, and really they've established this internet quality benchmark as part of their national strategy to connect schools. And again, it's this play between how does the data, and if it's good data, and of course updated data, how does that then inform policy improvements? So those are just a couple of examples of actually policy not just being a framework and I guess a thought framework, but really an implementation tool. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think those are really interesting examples that hopefully we'll have time to dig into some more. I want to turn to Steve and kind of get your perspective on this, coming, particularly having done the work you have from more of a civil society perspective, how you think about policy impact in your own work.
I think it's very hard to talk about policy in the telecom and internet sector without also talking about regulation, because it is a sector that tends towards natural monopoly. And so unless you have the vehicles for kind of creating a healthy environment for the growth of infrastructure, then you run the risk of concentration of ownership of infrastructure, which is, ultimately doesn't lead to low prices and affordability of access. And so I think from a policy point of view and a regulatory point of view, you have to think about, well, how then do you create an enabling environment to address especially the underserved areas that are particularly unattractive from a commercial perspective? And I think the tradition, historically, the way has been to kind of tax the existing operators and then use those taxes in the form of a universal service fund to kind of fund them to roll out into underserved areas. And I think that has worked up to a degree, but it only works so far. And what we see now is a kind of slowing of growth and in terms of investment in underserved areas. So I think it requires a kind of rethinking of access. And happily, thanks to technology, we can rethink access, because it used to be that an infrastructure provider had to solve all the problems, from undersea cables all the way down to handsets. And all of that ecosystem has become disaggregated now. We have wholesale access to fiber backbones. We have generic technologies, in Wi-Fi and LTE that are interoperable, that no longer make it as challenging for small operators to play. Yet the policy and regulatory ecosystem has been focused on the large investors. And so I think now, both from a policy and regulatory point of view, we need to direct those policies to enable a broader ecosystem of actors in terms of access, from municipal networks to community-owned infrastructure to national research and education networks. They are all critical players in this, and unless they're explicitly recognized and nurtured, just as new growth in a forest needs to be protected to some degree, then they will not succeed in the way that they can.
Yeah, no, I think that's also a really interesting point around the way that kind of advances in technology itself and the way we build networks have outpaced the regulatory environment in such a heavily regulated industry. Just to kind of turn to Mike now, in your work with APC, particularly as a membership organization, how do you all think about policy impact in the work that you do?
Thanks, Shadi. And yes, really to build on Steve's point that the policy environment is then expected to follow with a set of regulations which enables those policies. So from our perspective, we like to kind of work from the top and get policymaker support, but most of our work involves awareness raising of regulators and capacity building to help them catch up to the developments in technology and and new business models. And for example, Nigeria, where we're working extensively now, has not had a conducive environment for small-scale network operators and non-profit organizations to self-provide their own infrastructure. So we've been working with them consistently now for the last year, and that has actually resulted in a process where they are now actively researching the opportunities for establishing new licensing regimes for these small-scale providers. I think this kind of fits into a general picture of a growing awareness that connectivity isn't binary. Unfortunately, still the statistics we hear today are that X number of people, more than half now, are connected and the rest are unconnected. And I think that that's a very simplistic view of what's going on there, because the majority of those people who are connected on mobile networks where there's either a traffic cap or the business model means the operator is selling them bytes. And generally, these users are extremely constrained on their usage of the network because it's too costly for them. One of our partners, the Alliance for Internet Access, A4AI, has been working on trying to improve this viewpoint a bit in terms of affordability, but just to illustrate how the model has evolved and how far behind it still is. Back in 2015, they proposed this idea of 1 gigabyte of data for 2% of your monthly income as a target for policymakers and regulators. Now, that had to actually be adjusted within about 3 or 4 years to 2 gigabytes for 2% of the income. And now the discussion is around 5 gigabytes per month for that 2% of income. But now if you consider that the average North American uses about 20 gigabytes of mobile data a month, and the fact that the average household in the US consumes about 700 gigabytes a month, the average household size is around 2.5 people. So you're looking at an average data consumption of 200 gigabytes of fixed data in the household per person. And that's the average, which means that there are many people that are consuming double or more of that. So that 20 gigabytes of mobile network consumption is augmented by all the domestic connectivity that those people have, whereas the vast majority of people don't have any alternative but the mobile networks. So we're working a lot to raise the awareness of regulators that the goal isn't to provide more mobile network connectivity at these unaffordable rates.
So one of the things that I'm hearing from everyone is it almost seems like we can think about ways in which we can engage with achieving policy impact. In one vein, there's kind of encouraging change, which a few of you spoke about. Another is also kind of supporting better decision making as policymakers or regulators are trying to move in a particular direction. And I'm curious, what, in your experiences, what types of data or information do policymakers actually find, useful and actionable? Presumably they're not reading SIGCOMM papers. Maybe they are. That would be interesting to me. But what have you found in your work that really kind of helps move the needle, or at least advance the discussions in the directions you're trying to go? And whoever would like to can start with that.
Maybe I can go ahead, since I did provide some examples of useful data, but I think there's a big jump from policies I've worked I won't mention country, but I've worked extensively in some countries that have incredibly sophisticated policies and maybe very complex regulatory frameworks, and then the implementation is where the difficulty lies. So I would say that in terms of usefulness, I think there's always this reality check between what are we aiming for, and what are the realities of implementation bodies. Also, usually these policies are done or developed at well-resourced central government institutions, and then they are expected to be implemented at municipal level, perhaps, which, may not be up to, may not have the resources to kind of follow those guidelines. And so I think, again, just to say this link between policy that is informed in the realities and then shaped towards the reality of implementation to get those objectives. So I think one of the things that we've heard, and we have, as GIGA, we convene many different governments, including regulators, ICT ministries and education ministries, to come together on these exchange programs and kind of peer learning and share experiences around what is working for them. We know that the models that's, connected, I'm going binary here, Mike, sorry, but, the models that have worked up till now, 50%, whatever, but are not the ones that work later. And I've heard you say this a lot, Steve, we have to think differently. So how are we approaching that? And I think with policy implementers have so much on their plate that somehow simplifying that data is critical. And the map behind me or anything, I don't think we have the monopoly on maps. World Bank has this incredible data hub. It's really simplifying the data really helps. So it's that jump between, okay, we have these complex, really rigid, really robust policies, good regulation, and then somehow have tools that can enable that implementation.
Yeah. Maybe Steve,
perhaps I could. Oh, go ahead. Just to add into that I think there is a massive transparency gap here. In that one of the most powerful things that can move governments is benchmarking, right? Is regional benchmarking to look at, what is the cost of our access and how do we compare? And there are so many levels on which there is missing information. Mobile coverage maps. How hard would that be to have good mobile coverage maps? The GSMA did have a website covering some African countries, but they've taken it down, right? But that should be an obligation, right? And coverage maps that adhere to an open standard for what constitutes coverage. Fiber optic networks, obviously, if you're a small operator, knowing where you can get access to a point of presence is absolutely critical to knowing where you can get the cheapest possible backhaul. And yet, maps of fiber optic infrastructure, some operators share, some don't. There are gaps even in undersea cable information, and that telegeography has been great at mapping undersea cables, but they're not very detailed maps, and they totally fail to reveal the lack of diversity in West Africa, for instance, in the undersea cable cuts there. Radio spectrum access, right? How radio spectrum is being disposed from country to country, how it's being taxed, what organizations are paying for it. All of that information is variously available and often quite inaccessible, especially amounts of money that are being paid for in spectrum. So there's a huge need. If we're going to unlock these new business models, then we actually we have to unlock a new era of transparency around this, particularly because we're talking about public funds here that are funding these things.
Yeah, I want to continue this discussion and kind of turn the conversation towards Niccolò and expand this to also, first of all, what are the types of kind of data that kind of move the needle in the discussions that you have, but what are some examples of ways that, the academic community can contribute to those discussions? Steve mentioned, I think, highlighted a really important point around transparency and benchmarking, but I'm curious what you've seen in your work be effective, if anything.
Thanks. I think Steve touched a very critical point when it comes to lack of transparency and actually lack of data. We don't have to go too complicated. Sometimes you go to the country and you ask to the counterpart, so where is your fiber network? And the answer is often, well, we really don't know that. So even the public sector is not really aware of where the thousands of kilometers of fiber optic lies on their own territory. So this gives you the picture that sometimes lack of even basic data I don't even get into the discussion of how reliable are the data on coverage. But even these very extremely basic data are often incomplete, or it's very challenging to get a very full picture of, for instance, a georeference data set of where mobile towers are. This is pretty impossible to get in any country for many reasons, but that's clearly an obstacle when you need to provide a roadmap for close the digital gap or make this connectivity more affordable. So again, I don't think we need to complicate the discussion here. Let's start from the basic. Then, of course, we live in an era where we are completely overwhelmed by information and data. We as users create new information and new data. And this also can contribute to the discussion and to the policy making activity. I mentioned before few data providers that, for instance, are joining the data partnership program with the World Bank and other organizations such as UCLA or LinkedIn, etc. We have been using UCLA at the World Bank quite extensively. We were able, for instance, to show how important it is to access to a meaningful connectivity, particularly when it comes to a decent speed during the pandemic, and we were able to show in El Salvador, Colombia, and Ecuador, in collaboration with academics from Queen Mary University and the ISI Foundation in Turin, that people having access to a better speed were facing a lower rate of infection to COVID, taking into account all the factors of income and other social-demographic factors. So, good quality of internet really matters. And again, in this particular case, researchers, academics, academia in general can play a very important role to shape up the discussion. My suggestion to the academic community is to be more creative. So try to understand where you can find this new data and how to leverage this new level of information and move beyond the traditional data set, because this microdata can give you that user level granularity that can be extremely appealing for policymakers. And then, of course, in my opinion, like this is my personal experience, sometimes policymakers and academia should work a bit more closely, in a sense that academia should try to understand better what are really the challenges and the main questions that policymakers and regulators have, so that the two agendas can actually overlap and produce some meaningful results for the society. Thanks.
And kind of turning to you, Mike, if you had to, kind of in a similar vein, if you were giving advice to an academic who wanted to move their work into a more policy-relevant direction, or was trying to engage with some of the policy considerations that, let's say, the example you work with, where should they start? How should they think about timelines as well, for these types of things?
That's a great point on timelines. Working in remote and rural areas is a long-term commitment, and I think that's one of the things, is to adjust people's expectations that they're going to be able to come up with results in a 12-month study cycle. It could take 2 or 3 years to actually, from the engagement period to actually implementing and then gathering the results from your work. And I think another point to make here is that it's dangerous to generalize and talk about policymakers as a whole, or how you should do this more generally, because what we found is that even within country, the conditions are so varied, but between countries, the contexts are so different that you really have to adjust your approach to the particular contextual environment in which you're going to be working. In terms of areas of potential engagement, from our perspective, working in bandwidth-constrained environments where the costs are high, anything that can reduce data consumption and still provide useful levels of communication tools can help. So compression techniques, maybe priority channels for important messages, and also even to research some of the business models that provide for low bandwidth communications at a free cost, and then for high bandwidth communications at a more paid cost. We have some networks that are cross-subsidizing commercial users with the public who get free access, say, in off-peak periods. So there's a very diverse range of technical and business areas that could be researched to improve the environment for these remote and rural areas and improve connectivity. But I think they really have to be tailored to the local environment at a demographic level and at a national policy level. You know, we have countries that have authorization regimes where you can just go and set up a network and then tell the regulator about it, right the way through to environments where there's nothing going to be allowed except for the 3 or 4 mobile operators and 1 legacy fixed line operator.
Yeah, and maybe to turn to Sol, does that align with your experience around contextualizing the way you engage with individual country contexts, and again, with a mind towards researcher engagement? Are there particular moments or that folks should be on the lookout for as opportunities to be engaging in, from what you've seen?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I really want to just back, everything I've heard is so aligned to what our experience is, right? Maybe just to give you a sense of how the data gaps exist and really how nuanced the data is. So we usually use databases from the country, from government, and then clean that up. And even in the cleaning, there's quite a bit of value. But in some countries, we've applied satellite imagery, sort of trained a model to identify schools and see what we could find. And just in a sample of 8 countries, we found 23,000 schools missing or in the wrong place. So in the middle of the ocean, in the wrong country. And we're talking about schools, which we think, okay, I think that a lot of telecoms is so new and, evolving technology, and you don't know when a new tower, but we're talking about, of course, there can be schools that are quite mobile, that could be, but I'm talking about a lot of schools, 8 countries, 23,000 schools somewhere else. And so the idea of really understanding where the data, how much data do we really have? We've got this kind of phrase that we repeat a lot of, you can't fix what you can't see. I think, Nicolo, you mentioned this too. It's, and a lot of the data aggregates nationally, and it looks very different in underserved areas. I cannot emphasize that enough, or like the data gaps that we see in underserved areas at all levels. So static data, where is something? Where is the road? Where can I lay fiber to then more sophisticated data, which would be real time, really check that the service is still on, where it be connectivity, water, or whatever other, core service. And also, just looking at internet measurements, how they behave, and the assumptions that researchers might make if they look at, data sources that look at, for example, middle, high income urban settings. For example, I'm part of discussions that say we need so much for streaming or so much for gaming. That is so far from the reality to what the use of somebody in a rural area is, or underserved, not because, and for many different reasons. And so if we don't understand what that context needs and is doing, we're missing some critical insights that would then be informing the wrong kind of policy, if you see what I mean. So yeah, definitely context matters, and please, more researchers in the underserved areas.
Awesome. Well, as we start to kind of wrap up, and we'll open up to the floor to questions in a moment, I'm curious if we can kind of do one last kind of time around the table, kind of to that last point that you raised, Sol, of like, it'd be great to hear from everyone, are there gaps that you see in the work that's coming out from particularly like the SIGCOMM community, networking researchers, and the types of work that you do, or are there ways that your organizations are drawing on research that you found to be really effective? So good examples, bad examples, maybe we'll start in the room with Mike.
I started off on a thought. Just rephrase your question again, please.
Oh, it's basically, like, what are the gaps that you're seeing kind of in between the work that you do and like the research kind of outputs that are coming from the academic community?
Well, this is a question that occurred to me while you were talking that sent me off on a chain of thought around trying to gather data that is out there that's held just by the big tech companies in particular, because I think there's a lot of useful data there that could be used for policy making. And also for other businesses to use as a way of deciding where to go. I mean, a simple example would be if we all knew that there were 25 satellite links in a remote community because there was no fiber there. If the fiber operator knew that, they might be able to say, okay, well, we can justify laying fiber there because we know there's a market. Because satellite bandwidth is never going to compete with fiber, never going to be able to because of the incredible power that fiber has. So ultimately, fiber's there. So I see that satellite is a market maker for fiber, but the information isn't there to match the demand with the supply. So being able to liberate that kind of information, information about the use of social media and other network applications would also inform the policymaker and the regulator about the types of users, where those users are located, what they're using it for. So they would bring a lot more useful information to the policymaking and regulatory matrix.
Awesome. Steve?
Two things. I think correlating the investments in infrastructure with social and economic impact can be extremely powerful, and it's surprising how little of this has been done. So, for instance, what triggered for the World Bank's interest in the Open Fiber Data Standard was a study that picked up on a preliminary data set of terrestrial fiber deployments in Africa and correlated it with employment levels. So the closer you live to the fiber optic infrastructure, the higher the employment levels are. But this is the tip of the iceberg. And so this is why access to data is so important to actually trigger new insights to where, right now there are, millions, if not trillions of dollars going into, AI data centers. I mean, we need to be able to understand, what the potential impacts of things like that are. The second piece I want to say is that there needs to be a closer dialogue between academia and policy and regulation. And I think, part of that burden is on regulatory agencies and ministries of communication to draw researchers in. In Canada, the Canadian regulator will actually refund the cost of research for academics that make contributions to consultations, right? So if you're, as an academic, seeing the regulator also as a kind of source of funding research can be, a significant appeal to engaging. But there are other ways as well, internships within ministries of communication. But, bringing the two communities closer together, I think, is key.
Go to Nicola next.
Thanks. I would echo what Steve just said. We always keep ourselves in the digital bubble, right? But from a political perspective, digital is a sector in competition with other sectors. Digital competes for resources with transport, with energy, with health. So to influence decision makers at the highest level, you need to be able to make the link between digital uptake and socioeconomic development. And we lack, I think there is a gap when it comes to this discussion. For instance, everyone knows more or less that digital uptake can create jobs. Do we have good papers and numbers that we can bring to the table with the Ministry of Finance to claim exactly that investment on fiber optic or having a more affordable internet connectivity will create X jobs? Unfortunately, there are not many papers on this, or the there is a lack of evidence, even if everyone, and there is a universal consensus that yes, digital has a powerful impact and effect on socioeconomic development, but we struggle to quantify. For instance, all the attention to the subsea cable started with an academic paper with Hjort and Poulsen that were able to demonstrate that the arrival of internet submarine cables in some African countries had a direct impact on the job market. And that created the hype for, okay, this is important. Let's try to identify financial resources because we can see an impact. Before that, the discussion on subsea cables were for geeks, for people very much into the infrastructure deployment, and like the general audience didn't really understand what the subsea cables were doing in all this discussion, right? So I guess trying to establish a better link between digital uptake and economic and social development is one. Then, on the point of having a closer collaboration between policy and regulators and academia, I think academia should be more aware of the timeline that policymakers have. I know, like I've been working on papers, I've authored academic papers, I know it takes time, which often policymakers do not have. So we need to find a compromise for these two actors to work together. Policymakers follow a political agenda and they need to bring results. They cannot wait 3 years for a paper to be published and use the evidences for their political agenda. So understand that there is a timing aspect as well that plays a very big role in all of this because, governments go through elections and do not always stay more than 4 years.
Great point. And Sol, like to close us out?
Yeah, really echoing and support the points made to now, and really want to emphasize any research that can test assumptions. Really, I think that we've built a lot of assumptions based on very small data sets that are for very specific contexts. So again, my appeal to get more data and test that from underserved areas. That demonstrate also the data gaps, and then again, just the call for transparency. I mean, that is what we're trying to do at Giga. Really, there's no time now, but there's lots of evidence of how that makes everyone come to the table and work towards a single goal. So we can put that on the same page, and we can all, work together more effectively. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think we have time for any questions from the audience, briefly. We might be out of time. All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap here then. I want to thank our panelists so much for their time, for this interesting conversation. Definitely gave me a lot to think about. And thank you all for attending. See y'all.
Thank you.